Immediately upon entering Washington, we made a wrong turn in the heavy traffic, and while my mother was trying to read the road map and direct my father to our hotel, there appeared before us the biggest white thing I had ever seen. Atop an incline at the end of the street stood the U.S. Capitol, the broad stairs sweeping upward to the colonnade and capped by the elaborate three-tiered dome. Inadvertently, we had driven right to the very heart of American history, and whether we knew it in so many words, it was American history, delineated in its most inspirational form, and we were counting on to protect us against Lindbergh. "Look!" my mother said, turning to Sandy and me in the back seat. "Isn't it thrilling?" The answer, of course, was yes, but Sandy appeared to have fallen into a patriotic stupor, and I took my cue from him and let silence register my awe as well. Just then a motorcycle policeman pulled alongside us. "What's up, Jersey?" he called through the open window. "We're looking for our hotel," answered my father. "What's it called, Bess?" My mother, enthralled only a moment earlier by the dwarfing majesty of the Capitol, immediately went pale, and her voice was so feeble when she tried to speak that she couldn't be heard above the traffic. "Gotta get you folks out of here," the cop shouted. "Speak up, missus." "The Douglas Hotel!" It was my brother, eagerly calling out to him and trying to get a good look at the motorcycle. "On K Street, officer!" "Attaboy!" He raised his arm in the air, signaling the cars behind us to stop, and for ours to follow him as he made a U-turn and started in the opposite direction up Pennsylvania Avenue. Laughing, my father said, "We're getting the royal treatment." "But how do you know where he's taking us?" my mother asked. "Herman, what's happening?" With the cop out front, we were headed past one big federal building after another, when Sandy excitedly pointed toward a rolling lawn just to our left. "Up there!" he shouted. "The White House!" Whereupon my mother began to cry. "It isn't," she tried to explain just before we reached the hotel and the cop waved goodbye and roared away. "It isn't like living in a normal country anymore. I'm terribly sorry, children. Please forgive me." But then she began to cry again. In a little room at the rear of the Douglas, there was a double bed for my parents and cots for my brother and me, and no sooner had my father tipped the bellhop who'd unlocked our door and set our bags down inside the room than our mother was her old self, or pretended as much by arranging the contents of our suitcases in the dresser, and noting appreciatively that the drawers were freshly laid with lining paper. We'd been on the road since leaving home at 4 a.m, and it was after 1 p.m. when we got back down the street to look for a place for lunch. The car was parked across from the hotel, and standing beside it was a sharp-faced little man in a double-breasted gray suit, who doffed his hat and said, "My name is Taylor, folks. I am a professional guide to the nation's capital. If you don't want to be wasting time, you might want to hire someone like me. I'll drive for you so you don't get lost. I'll take you to the sights, tell you all there is to know. I'll wait and pick you up. I'll make sure you eat where the price is right and the food is tasty, and all it will cost, using your own automobile, is $9 a day. Here's my authorization," he said, and he unfolded a document of several pages to show to my father. "Issued by the Chamber of Commerce," he explained. "Verlin M. Taylor, sir, official D.C. guide since 1937. January 5th, 1937, to be exact, the very day the 75th U.S. Congress convened." The two shook hands, and in his insurance man's best business-like manner, my father flipped through the guide's papers before handing them back to him. "Looks good to me," my father said. "But I don't think $9 a day is in the cards, Mr. Taylor, not for this family, anyway. I appreciate that, but on your own, sir, you doing the driving and not knowing your way around, and then trying to find a parking space in this city, well, you and your family won't see half of what you'll be able to see with me, and you won't enjoy it anywhere near as much either. Why, I could drive you to a nice place to have your lunch, wait for you with the car, and then we can start right off with the Washington Monument. After that, down the mall to the Lincoln Memorial, Washington to Lincoln, our two greatest presidents. That's how I always like to begin. You know that Washington never did live in Washington. President Washington chose the site. He signed the bill making it the permanent seat of government, but it was his successor, John Adams, who was the first president to move into the White House in 1800. November 1st, to be exact. His wife Abigail joined him there 2 weeks later. Among the many interesting curios in the White House, there is a celery glass owned by John and Abigail Adams. "Well, that's something I did not know," my father replied. "But let me take this up with my wife." Quietly he asked her, "Can we afford this? He sure knows his oats." my mother whispered. But who sent him? How did he spot our car? That's his job, Bess. To find who's the tourists. That's how the man makes a living. My brother and I were huddled up beside them, hoping our mother would shut up and that the easy-talking guy with the pointy face and short legs would be hired for the duration. What do you want? My father said, turning to Sandy and me. Well, if it costs too much, Sandy began. Forget the cost, my father replied. Do you like this guy or not? He's a character, Dad, Sandy whispered. He looks like one of those duck decoys. I like when he says, to be exact. Bess, my father said, this man is a bona fide guide to Washington, D.C. Don't believe he's ever cracked a smile, but he's an alert little guy, and he couldn't be more polite. Let me see if he'll take $7. He stepped away from us, walked up to the guide, who they spoke seriously for a few minutes, and then the deal struck. The two again shook hands, and my father said aloud, Okay, let's eat. As always, teeming with energy, even when there was nothing to do. It was hard to say what was the most unbelievable, my being out of New Jersey for the first time in my life, my being 300 miles from home in the nation's capital, or our families being chauffeured in our own automobile by a stranger, called by the same surname as the 12th President of the United States, whose profile adorned the 12-cent red velvet stamp in the album in my lap, hinged between the blue 11-cent Polk and the green 13-cent Fillmore. Washington, Mr. Taylor was telling us, is divided into 4 sections, northwest, northeast, southeast, and southwest. With some few exceptions, the streets running north and south are numbered, and the streets running east and west are lettered. Of all the existing capitals in the Western world, this city alone was developed solely to provide a home for the national government. That is what makes it different not only from London and Paris, but from our own New York and Chicago. Did you hear that? My father asked, looking over his shoulder at Sandy and me. Did you hear that, Bess, what Mr. Taylor said about why Washington is so special? Yes, she said, and took my hand in hers to assure herself by assuring me that everything was now going to be all right. But I had only my one concern from the time we entered Washington until we left, preserving my stamp collection from harm. The cafeteria where Mr. Taylor dropped us off was clean and cheap, and the food as good as he'd said it would be, and when we finished our meal and headed for the street, there was our car pulling up to double park out front. What timing! My father cried. Over the years, Mr. Taylor said, we learned to estimate how long it takes a family to eat their lunch. Was that okay, Mr. Roth? Or was that okay, Mrs. Roth? He asked my mother. Everything to your taste? Very nice, thank you. So everybody's ready for the Washington Monument, he said, and off we drove. You know, of course, who the monument commemorates, our first president, and in my opinion, our in the opinion of most, our best president, alongside President Lincoln. I'd include FDR in that list, you know. A great man, and the people of this country turned him out of office, my father said. And just look what we got instead. Mr. Taylor listened courteously, but offered no response. Now, he resumed, you've all seen photos of the Washington Monument, but they don't always communicate just how impressive it is. At 555 feet, 5 1/8 inches above the ground, it is the tallest masonry structure in the world. The new electric elevator will carry you to the top in 1 1/4 minutes. Otherwise, you can take a winding staircase for 893 steps to the top by foot. The view from up there has a radius of some 15 to 20 miles. It's worth a look. There, see it? He said, straight ahead. Minutes later, Mr. Taylor found a parking spot on the monument grounds, and when we left the car and trotted bandy-legged alongside us, explaining, the monument was cleaned just a few years back for the first time. Just imagine that for a cleaning job, Mrs. Roth. They used water mixed with sand and steel-bristled brushes. Took 5 minutes and cost $100,000. Under FDR, my father asked. I believe so, yes. And do people know? My father asked. Do people care? No, they want an airmail pilot running the country instead. And that's not the worst of it. Mr. Taylor remained outside while we entered the monument. At the elevator, our mother, who again had taken hold of my hand, drew close to our father and whispered, You mustn't talk like that. Like what? About Lindbergh. That's just expressing my opinion. But you don't know who this man is. I sure do. He's an authorized guide with the documents to prove it. This is the Washington Monument, Bess, and you're telling me to keep my thoughts to myself as though the Washington Monument is situated in Berlin? his speaking so bluntly distressed